potentially evicted, and then we'll discuss direct election of the mayor, otherwise known as ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting. Today, we're joined by a number of speakers to address these issues. We'll kick off the program with Rui Arango, campaign chair of No Eviction Without Representation. Then Todd Ulrich, board president of the Boulder Area Rental Housing Association, or BARA, will provide his feedback on why BARA opposes this. After addressing evictions, we'll move to the discussion about direct election of the mayor. Matt Benjamin, who has led the Our Mayor, Our Choice campaign, will talk about why he feels this is important. He will be followed by former City Council member Steve Pomerantz, who will discuss his concerns about the initiative. After each issue, we will open it up to questions from the audience. Please use the Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get your questions addressed. If we don't have time to cover your question or you have additional questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me, lori.call@boulderchamber.com, or you can reach out to Tyler, and he and I will make sure that your questions are addressed and followed up accordingly. As John mentioned, immediately following the policy roundtable, our Community Affairs Council will be recongregating to debrief this discussion, and for those members, you should have received a separate Zoom information and link. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and kick it off with Rui.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So my name is Rui Rango, and I am the campaign chair for the No Eviction Without Representation, or newer, citizen-led ballot initiative. It will be measure 2B on the City of Boulder ballot this November. So newer will create here in Boulder the most comprehensive anti-eviction program in the country. Newer will provide free legal counsel to every single tenant that experiences eviction in our city, regardless of age, income, or immigration status. It will also provide rental assistance to those same tenants when they are at risk of eviction. I will let you folks know that the majority of evictions over financial issues in this country occur over less than $600. So that rental assistance is very important to combating eviction. All these benefits will be enjoyed by our city at no additional cost to the city itself. The program will be funded by a very small excise tax placed directly on landlords who operate rental units here in the City of Boulder. That tax will only be $75 per year per rental unit. So if you're a small-time landlord and you have one unit, you will pay $75 a year. If you are fortunate enough to own, let's say, 10 units, you would pay $750 a year. That's going to be enough to fund this program. The estimates on the total amount of funding are going to fluctuate. But the city now believes it's going to be somewhere between $1.6 and $1.9 million. That will change depending on the rental units that come onto the market and off the market. I will also let you folks know, I imagine many people here are of fortunate circumstances, and that's great. But many people who are of less fortunate circumstances, especially here in Boulder, already know that we are undergoing an eviction crisis in our nation. And the eviction crisis is happening right here in Boulder as well. So the number of summons to eviction court, that is where tenants are evicted every Friday, right here in downtown Boulder, have increased by 21% over the past 5 years. So imagine that a 21% increase in inflation or murder or homelessness. And I invite you to treat that figure with the same amount of gravity as those other things. You know, and our eviction crisis here is happening, and all this data, this 21% increase is all happening before COVID even hit. So right now we are looking at a COVID eviction epidemic, another one coming down the pipe. Right now, the most recent study has projected that up to 450,000 Coloradans are going to experience eviction at the end of this COVID epidemic. Right now, that's looking like that's going to be December, unless the CDC extends their moratorium on evictions. So that's a huge number of people who are going to be impacted by this. evictions ruins lives. Eviction creates homelessness directly, housing insecurity in the future, financial hardship, job loss. It is a violence in our community, and it affects everyone, not just folks who are evicted. I think newer is pretty simple. If you want to reduce evictions here in our city, if not eliminate them outright and expand tenant rights and protections, then newer's for you. And if you don't, I'm curious why you don't want those things. And I think that's all I have to say for now. So thank you.
Thanks, Rui. We'll go ahead, move to Todd at this point. I'm not seeing any questions at this moment. And then certainly we'll open it up for additional questions after Todd's comments to address the broader issue. Todd?
Thank you, everyone. So Barha's position is one that aligns with the desired outcome here, but we just feel that the methodology won't actually succeed in what the attempt is. Part of the problem here is we're looking at the data, and the data that we've been looking at comes from the Eviction Lab, the Colorado Judicial Branch, which puts out an annual statistic report, and then the FED filings for Boulder County. You know, we've heard that there's an eviction crisis, but we're just not able to find the data that suggests that. The statewide eviction rate right now is about 5.48%. Those are the filing rates. In Boulder County, it's 2.59%. So we've actually got quite a lot lower rate of eviction than even statewide, and Colorado is actually lower than the national average. So in looking at the number of actual evictions that we've had in Boulder County, there were 1,223 last year. That number's been relatively stable for about 4 to 5 years, but there has been a small increase over that time period. About 60% of those are actually in the city of Boulder, which amounts to about 730 eviction filings, not all of which result in evictions. But looking at the market rate for what an attorney would cost and the number of evictions that we're actually seeing, that would cost about $370,000. This initiative is asking for $1.9 million. And we do agree that the rental assistance is an important piece of this. Now, there are other programs in place in town that could benefit from some of this money as well. EFA is one of the bigger programs, and they are desperately needing funds. Like I said, we do agree with part of this discussion. The initiative does appear to provide some financial support for attorneys to provide advice prior to even getting into court. We do think that part of it is a good idea. We see a lot better outcomes with both parties when there is some discussion that happens up front. But some of the other issues that we have with it is there's no cap on the attorney's fees that are paid. There's no criteria on who receives the rental assistance versus legal help. And we don't know if there's an income qualification for the tenants. There doesn't seem to be a reevaluation period to see if it's actually accomplishing what the stated goal is. There's no sunset period to even take a look at that. We don't know what happens to the funds that are not used, who manages those. And the yearly program, the review of the program is just given to the mayor and the city manager. We'd like to see some other involvement in that as well. So it's an awful lot of money that we don't know exactly how it's going to be managed, and we feel like it's quite a bit overkill for what the actual data suggests the level of evictions are. So those are the broad strokes on why we don't oppose the stated goal here. We just oppose the methodology and would like to see a little different approach.
Thanks, Todd. Rui, is there anything that you wanted to respond to that Todd raised before we move to questions?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, I heard Todd the other day say that it was, they estimated the attorneys would cost $400,000. So I guess now it's down to $370,000. The truth is that it's very easy to give an estimate for how much a program is going to cost when it doesn't exist yet. The actual attorneys that we spoke to and the actual veterans from programs that are just like Newer that operate all throughout the country gave us a substantially higher financial requirement for those attorneys. The second point about all of this money, I don't know if you folks know, but the City of Boulder gave $700,000 in rental assistance, and they distributed that in 3 months, okay? So the idea that there is not a need here in Boulder for that is ridiculous. The reason that Newer is going to be such a successful program is because it couples rental assistance with legal counsel. And it will cure evictions. Most evictions are curable, either through that legal counsel or through the one or possibly multiple time payment of rental assistance. In terms of the oversight of the program does in fact have oversight. We'll have kind of a executive committee of tenants, if you will. 5 tenants who must rent in the City of Boulder will form the executive committee of the program. They will work in concert with the city. A legal services coordinator position will be created, and those folks will be responsible for running the program. They will be working with the city. They will have access to city resources. Lastly, programs like this, they're called more generally right to counsel programs, are already in operation in like 11 other cities in the country. And literally every single city they are implemented in, they cause a sharp reduction in evictions. So in San Francisco, in 1 year, the year after they established their program, evictions fell 10%. In New York City, the 4 years after they established their right to counsel program, evictions fell 27%. So this whole idea that just because there aren't as many evictions here in Boulder as there are in, Detroit or something like that, is a reason not to have an anti-eviction program in Boulder, seems pretty ridiculous to me.
Thanks, Rory. Let's go ahead and move to questions at this point. From Brian Copham at the Farmers Market, he mentions people who own rental properties also have financial obligations. How does the anti-eviction effort address their needs and avoid unduly burdening landlords? And I'll have both of you respond to that if that makes sense. Rui, do you want to respond initially?
Yeah. First off, I don't think $75 a year for someone who owns property is unduly burdening them. Second of all, Newer is not changing tenant law in any way. So all the same tenant laws in the City of Boulder at the state level, at the federal level are going to apply. Newer is not going to change how judges rule. What they are going to do are reduce evictions. And one of the good things about these programs is a big part of that reduction in evictions is curing these issues before they even get to court. I think I've witnessed hundreds of eviction court cases, and I can tell you that I don't think landlords like going to eviction court. As a matter of fact, it tends to be expensive for them. And even filing to have a day in eviction court, it's called an FED fee, is $117 to do that once. So even that one single step for a landlord to move forward with an eviction is more than the small tax landlords would pay with Newer. Lastly, you can settle when both sides, and landlords overwhelmingly do have access to attorneys compared to tenants. When both sides are able to understand what their rights are in a situation, and they have right now 17 days under state law before their day in eviction court, they're much more likely to come to some sort of understanding and both walk away happy with some sort of stipulation. That means less time that the landlord has to spend on it, less legal cost as well, as landlords do retain their own attorneys, and less court costs. So I think it's going to make things much smoother for landlords and tenants, and no one wants evictions.
Thanks, Rui. Todd, feedback from your end.
Sure. We are seeing some feedback from our membership. There are a lot of people that operate, the majority of our membership, as a matter of fact, operate 1 to 4 units. And this may be part of their retirement. It may be part of just their general income, but they are pretty worried about the increase in fees. This is not the only one that landlords are seeing. So there are mortgages that have to be paid. There are other issues surrounding COVID and the collection of rent people being able to pay. So there will be some additional stress and additional expense on those landlords. I think a lot of people don't understand how thin the margins actually are on a lot of these rental properties. And of course, a lot of people think landlords are just rich and they can absorb another increase in fee and costs for them. The truth is that most people are saying with this fee and some additional ones that are coming from the city, they're expecting to have to raise their rent. They're not wanting to, but they have to, because if they're operating at a loss, they can't sustain that. So it's ironic that we feel we're advocating for the tenants because this is likely going to push rent higher in Boulder.
Thanks, Todd.
Hey, I got to respond to that. Come on. I'll be real fast. I'll say this. I never had a landlord in my life that needed an excuse to raise my rent. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. We'll go to the next comment question from Judy Mapole. Low-income people are effectively shut out of our civil court system. This measure seems like a step toward fixing that. Isn't this also an equity issue? Todd, do you want to respond to that? And then Rui, you can respond as well.
Sure. Like I said, I think the goal here is something that we share concern and the desired outcome. We definitely agree. With Boulder's eviction rate even being as low as it is, we still would like to reduce it. As Rui said, and I do agree with him, our membership, our landlords don't want to have to evict. It's not good for business. It's not good for the tenants. It's not good for the owner. They don't want the vacancies. It increases their costs. That's not the goal here. It's not to, Rui seems to insinuate that we want to do evictions. We don't. We want to reduce them at every turn. We just feel that the mechanism and the process that is trying to be implemented here won't actually successfully lower the eviction rate. So yes, to answer the question of the participant, it is a bit of an equity thing. And we would like to see, and we do agree with rental assistance and assistance prior to getting into court. We just disagree with the amount, how it's administered, and the way it's being implemented.
Thanks, Todd. Rui?
Yeah, of course. It's harder for lower income people. I would say effectively impossible for them to access legal counsel, and it's absolutely an equity issue. As part of the lead up to this initiative work, we conducted a year-long research project in which we went to eviction court almost every Friday and recorded the results from over 413 eviction cases here in Boulder. And we found out that tenants had access to an attorney in court only 2% of the time. So 98% of the time, tenants were showing up to a court where the decision would affect their livelihoods, and they didn't have access to legal counsel. Compare that to landlords who 88% of the time did have access to legal counsel. Huge equity issue. And Newer will provide legal counsel and give these not just lower income tenants, but all tenants access to justice in and out of the courtroom.
Thank you. Another question, won't this just amount to a rental rate increase as passed on the cost of the new fee and cost of their own attorney?
I will say that's what our membership, I'll say our membership is suggesting that is the case. We represent about 14,000 units, and we've been polling our membership and talking about this issue for quite a while. And as I said, this, as well as some additional fees that are coming from the city, will force a number of our members to have to raise the rent.
Thank you. Rui, any feedback on that?
Yeah, I kind of feel like we covered this a little bit before, but I'll elaborate. It's entirely possible that landlords could raise rent. Landlords often raise rent, and they rarely need an excuse. And if in fact some landlords, it won't be all, because we talked to quite a few landlords who are happy and quite willing to just pay $75 a year. If some landlords increase their rent by $75 a year, that's going to be one of the smallest rent increases for tenants here in the city of Boulder. It must be said that access to legal counsel in eviction court runs around $250 per hour. So even if landlords do decide to be a little punitive and increase that rent, the value for the tenants is going to vastly outweigh that.
Thank you. And just a reminder to folks, it looks like there might be a hand raised. If you could go ahead and post questions in the Q&A if you have them, that would be helpful. Before we wrap up this section, I just wanted to do one more check-in to see if there were additional questions on this issue. Okay, Rui, Todd, any final comments before we wrap up this and pivot?
Lori, it just does look like there's a question. Do you want me to just ask it?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, John.
Yeah, sure. It says, doesn't the free market regulate prices? And that was from Judy Mamale. And so I guess this is a response to the question about whether or not the increase in the fee and then the attorney's fees being passed on to the potentially being passed on to the tenants would be regulated by free market price of the rents.
I would say yes, across the board. A truly free market would be what sets the pricing. These are mandated fees that are creating extra expenses for the owners. And I do believe that based on the polling that we've done with our membership, that members will be needing to increase prices because of the increased expense.
Thanks, Todd. Rui, anything you wanted to add?
I mean, I think comments on the free market, as it were, don't seem particularly productive when we're talking about an anti-eviction program that will place a $75 a year tax on folks. If some landlords decide to raise the rent by $75 or more, they'll be competing presumably with those landlords who don't.
Thank you. Another question. I assume the financial burden for landlords was in housing tenants who are unable to pay rent, not the fee. Is that incorrect?
Could you ask that one more time? I'm not following.
Sure. It says, I assume the financial burden for landlords was in housing tenants who are unable to pay rent, not the fee. Is that incorrect?
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that.
I just
Okay.
maybe I can clarify. I think what the question is asking is, isn't the cost to the landlord significant in terms of the person who maybe they're trying to evict who hasn't paid rent for a period of time? Is that the major cost here that is to be considered?
I'd certainly say it's one of them. I can't say it's the major. To Roy's point, oftentimes this is not thousands of dollars. It can be less than that, which can trigger some of these actions. But the overall increase in rent is going to also then make it more difficult to qualify tenants. It seems to almost exacerbate the problem for those who can't pay rent. If rent does increase, it won't be across the board, as he suggested. I agree. Not everyone will. But those that run thinner margins, operate 1 to 4 units, or the smaller scale landlords will likely need to increase their costs. Therefore, it'll be harder to qualify tenants to be able to rent those units.
Thank you. Roy?
Yeah, so I want to revisit something because I think this question does come up occasionally. Even though I've said it before, I'll say this again for clarification's sake. So newer is not going to change how evictions are carried out. It's not going to change how judges rule, and it's not going to change or alter in any way tenant law at the city, state, or federal level. So I can tell you, if you don't pay your rent as a tenant, there's a 99% chance you are getting evicted, and you are getting evicted fairly quickly if the landlord chooses to do that. And the attorneys who would be created and give legal counsel to tenants under newer would explain that very clearly. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Any other final questions or comments around this evictions issue? Okay, if folks do have additional questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to us at the chamber, and we're happy to connect the dots going forward. So thank you, Rui. Thank you, Todd. We appreciate your joining us this afternoon. With that, we'll go ahead and pivot, and I am having some technical difficulties. I guess it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if they weren't there, and so I will tee up Matt Benjamin, who's the campaign leader for our mayor, our choice. I'll momentarily log off and log on, but Matt, if you could go ahead and kick off your comments, and then he'll be followed by Steve. Apologies for the technical difficulties.
Thanks, Larry, and thank you, Boulder Chamber, for the opportunity to speak to you guys about our measure and the merits for it, and hopefully have a nice little dialogue on how we do it. So I'm going to share my screen and show some a couple slides, and hopefully that will help clear things up here. So our mayor, our choice. We got started really kind of over a little hodgepodge group of us really got going on this a little over a year and a half ago, and really sort of formalized earlier this spring with really a simple goal, and that was to bring about greater diversity and equity and inclusion in our election system. We were very clearly interested in trying to reduce the political polarization that is growing in our community and find ways to moderate the political temperature that we're seeing in Boulder. We are ballot measure 2E. Diane Marshall sent that out today, so everyone's excited with their new numbers and letters. So we are 2E. So a big question is, why elect the mayor? Right now, Boulder is the largest city in Colorado that does not elect its mayor, and by quite a large margin. I think the nearest largest city that doesn't is around 50,000 people in population. So what we have here is really just a relic of a time long past. This is a pretty common, more common form of government for communities that are smaller to not elect their mayor. And as Boulder grew, this piece just didn't quite grow with us. And as a result, what we have is a need to create a more direct line of accountability in our local government. We do so with council, but adding yet another layer to that is just absolutely more pro-democracy. It's a greater establishment and confirmation of our democratic principles. One of the other things that this leads to is a clearer understanding of what issues and policies a majority of Boulder residents care about. We don't get that in our current council elections. We have individuals that run and get a reasonable size of Boulder, but we never get to hear in a single election, a single voice, what are the singular issues or group of issues that a majority of Boulder cares about. And that is an important and almost invaluable tool to help reduce polarization, but more importantly, let voters know that they're being heard. And when you have a mayor, even in our current system, that is then elected, that accountability and that knowledge of what those issues are is vital for not just council, but for the electorate to know that we're headed in the right direction. And like I said before, it really just we just deserve a more fair democratic process, given almost all of our other sister cities of equal size or larger do this. So why use instant runoff ranked choice voting? Well, first off, it actually, just electing our mayor with our current plurality system is just not good enough. In fact, all we're doing is just regurgitating the same issues with our election system in just yet another election. And so we didn't see that as a valuable addition to our democratic process, but bringing in an alternative voting system that brings in some strong merits by increasing voter turnout, increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity among marginalized groups, diminishing the spoiler effect and strategic voting, and having a system that requires you actually have 50% or more of the vote to win. These are all things that I think, in terms of wanting to protect our democracy, we share. And so that is an important part about why we chose this alternative voting method. And it is worth noting that this is really kind of an introduction to how we could improve our voting system at council as a whole. And we have seen this now in a couple of recent council meetings that it looks like a vast majority of city council right now is actually interested in these alternative voting methods for council. Our team wants to take us there too. We found that an incremental approach might be the best way to get the city and our residents really used to the voting method before we take on a bigger challenge in trying to do one for all of council as a whole. And so those are the reasons. And let's just sort of talk about what is in our ballot measure. It's important to know that we've kind of gone through a few iterations. We went through the voter approval process of trying to gather signatures, and we gathered roughly 5,800 signatures in the middle of a pandemic. And yes, we all know that it was a crazy and an unfortunate circumstance of having election rules change and be unknown and some bad guidance. And unfortunately, we were kind of caught in the middle of that. But as a result, we still gathered those signatures and gathered community support, and also got a majority of council to pass this and put it on the ballot. But what that meant is that the ballot measure changed a little bit. And so two really critical things have changed since council took this on to pass it. First and foremost, that the elections are going to be held on odd years, just like city council. Some of you probably heard that our previous version of this, when we were going out to get signatures, had an even year non-presidential. We did that strictly to try to harness the will, the vote, and the inclusion of up to 20,000 more voters that vote in those elections. Council saw it a little differently, and they wanted to simplify the process, and we understand that. And in our negotiations with them, we said, you know what, that's fine. Let's keep it odd year. Let's keep that simple, and we were okay with that. The other major change is that we originally had a 4-year term for mayor, and city council wanted a 2-year term for mayor. And in many ways, this was synergistic with the idea of accountability, that every 2 years, the mayor would go back to the voters, or the mayor would have to be up for election as a really way to reconstitute that accountability. And so we were okay with that as well. And so that was really the main thrust of those two changes. We have established term limits for the mayor. The mayor can serve no more than 8 years. And those term limits are also balanced with that of city council and the current term limits there as well. And so it is important to sort of know that there are some changes on what is substantive versus what this previous iteration was. And so if we all work from the current version that council passed, I think we'll find that this is actually a better, stronger proposal than even we originally went to voters with, which is always a good thing. And that makes it sort of a unique process unto itself, as messy as it was to get here. Last of all, I'll just sort of end with, we're already picking up a whole slew of endorsements, and we just actually last night picked up the endorsement from Boulder County Dems. And you can see a lot of folks in and around our community, current, former, and soon to be elected officials, support our measure and support it on the merits and the benefits that will bring our community. And in closing, vote yes, 2E for democracy. Please, any questions? And we'll get those at the end. Thanks again for the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. And as you know, I was having a couple of technical glitches. I know you would consider doing a poll. Was that something that you wanted to do?
Not in the time. I thought it would just be it would shave too much time off the conversation, and I didn't want to interrupt with Steve and then try to fill at the end. It just was cleaner to not do it. We'll have plenty of chances to do mock elections over the next 2 months.
Fair enough. Thanks, Matt. All right, Steve, your perspective.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Sure can. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, I'm practicing here. Okay, here we go. So there should be a slide up, correct?
Not yet.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, got it. How about now?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
All right, so got a lot of things to say. First, my most important thing to say is designing something like this should not be done the way it was done. Matt and I have both served on a working group together, doing a lot of things, a lot of controversy, worked through a lot of issues, and that's the much better way to design this stuff than throwing it at with the citizens, then the council, and then having a debate over it, frankly. That's the most important thing. Now, the general city process that led to this 10-day staff review period that all petitions get was a complete failure. All of the initial issues that were with this petition should have been fixed then. The charter amendment process, as Matt pointed out, was a disaster. The council knew there were problems and they didn't fix them. Treating petitions differently One got on the ballot, this one got rejected. This is the occupancy one, and then the South Boulder Creek CU South one was denied the ability to circulate. Really not appropriate. And all that brings me to, do you really want the city running an election? The county says they can't do it right now, so the city might end up running this. Do you want city officials to work for the council running the council election? I don't. On the measure itself, it doesn't have any experience requirements for candidates. So you could have lots of relatively unqualified candidates on a large grid of voters. It's easy for voters to make mistakes. Now, another issue with the ballot. There are three subjects in this ballot. First is direct election of mayor. Second is ranked choice voting. Third is an increase in term limits. But the term limits issue is not identified in the ballot title. And that term limit change would allow former council members like me to run for mayor who were previously term limited, so could not run. That should have been in the ballot title, and it might make some of you concerned. Now, having spent 10 years on council and now almost 40 years involved in the process, and I led a lot of major changes to improve the process, to me, having a mayor who reflects policy issues rather than has experience, supportive counsel, much more important, these things. Somebody who can organize policy work, that's critical. And that's why sometimes things don't work if the mayor doesn't do that. Somebody who can ensure that citizens are included in a way that matters, not this pro forma stuff that we have. And somebody that can represent the city. I don't see direct election getting us a better mayor. It may make things worse. And as to the mayor representing issues, sorry, there are way too many issues to have one person vote on one person. Somehow they're magically going to lead to some proper representation. Now, on to ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is one approach, but it can increase polarization, and approval voting, which is an alternative, can decrease it. Approval voting is different. You get to vote for as many candidates as you approve of. 1 vote, 2 votes, 3, you can do as many times as you want. Now, having studied game theory under Thomas Schelling when I was at Harvard, I can tell you no voting system is perfect. Everything can be gamed. But approval voting can deliver what most voters want. It's easy to implement, really easy. Now, here's a scenario. So sorry, this is going to actually take a little attention here. I got 3 candidates running for mayor: fast growth, medium growth, and slow growth. Voters are split completely equally on the growth spectrum. Most voters like the medium candidates, so if we vote for medium, it's first or second choice. For first choice, here we go. 35% support fast, 35% support slow, and 30% support medium. Okay, sounds pretty balanced. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, and then 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. Completely balanced. So how do you test the system? You do head-to-head comparison. So head-to-head, medium gets 65% versus fast. Here's 30%, and then you get this 35, so there's 65. Medium gets 65 versus slow. 30% plus this, so that's 65 versus slow. So medium should win because it's clearly the favored candidate against either of the other 2. Now, ranked choice voting. Fast and slow each get 35%. So what happens with that? Now, medium only gets 30%, this much here. So medium is dropped out. So now what you've done is polarize the situation that wasn't polarized to start with. Now, under approval voting, medium gets the most votes, as is most voters' first or second choice. So approval voting matches the head-to-head outcome, which is the best test, and it's just counting votes. So in summary, ranked choice voting produces the most polarized, least satisfactory outcome. Approval voting produces the least polarized and most satisfactory outcome. And critically, approval voting can be run by the county. It's just like a city council election. The only difference is you vote for as many as you like, and the person with the most votes is elected mayor. That's it. Now, I'm sure if Matt and I and Mark and a couple other people sat down in a room, we could figure out a lot more useful information on both of these things. But since we're in this format, here we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate your feedback, and thanks for keeping us on our toes this afternoon with a high deal of math to boot. We'll go ahead and move into questions at this point. I am seeing one, and I'll ask it of both of you for feedback. What happens if there isn't a candidate for mayor that gets 50% of the votes? So Matt, if you want to respond initially.
Well, that's certainly a big what if. It's highly unlikely. I think what you end up running into is you got to follow the rules that are currently with the Secretary of State, which is then they have a separate mechanism, and we can define that ourselves. And this is really up to the county clerk and the city when they actually talk about how they want to set up the implementation process of this. That is where they can define that. There's a few ways in which they can do it. Other communities do it a few different ways. But we're talking about a highly, highly unlikely, and I think it's only happened once across the US over the last 20 years where that has occurred. So again, very unlikely, and that occurred for various obvious reasons because it was a special election and the mayor had died. They had to call the special election in just a few days. So they didn't have enough voters to really parse out the difference. So yeah, what happens when the mayor doesn't get 50%? That's a very unlikely scenario, but we would follow the rules of the Secretary of State and or what the county and the city decide. And so I wouldn't predetermine that because that's up to them to figure out.
Thanks, Matt. Steve, any additional context with that particular issue?
No, I think Matt's right. I mean, the probability when you have 30-odd thousand people voting that you're going to get an exact equal vote is extremely low. So I wouldn't, and it, like Matt says, it's been resolved. The very few times it happens, it's been resolved. So I don't see it as a big issue. It's certainly not a reason to pick this or not pick this, since it could happen under the current system for a council seat.
Thanks, Steve. Another question, would an elected mayor have more authority than they have now? Matt, if you want to respond initially, and then Steve.
No, I mean, the answer is we're keeping the role of the mayor exactly the same. We're going to say with a strong city manager, weak mayor as it's called. The only thing I'll say is, when you have a mayor that is elected by the people and you have, the will of the majority, the mayor's influence that it currently has is then reflected. And you're right, the mayor holds a permanent seat in the agenda setting committee. And that is an important piece because the agenda are the issues that council then talks about. And when you have a permanent seat there, that's an important piece in terms of what are the issues that council has to discuss. And if you have someone who's been elected on policies and positions that represent a majority of this community, then it's another check and balance to make sure that indeed council does raise the issues in their meetings that are the focus of what a majority of Boulder cares about. And so that is an important piece that is currently not there. And it's an important piece of accountability that then comes up when that person does come up for re-election.
Thanks, Matt. Steve, additional feedback from your end?
Yes, I was the person who created the agenda committee and that whole process. So, this is back in 1987. And for about 6 years, it worked extremely well, mainly because unlike the current structure, first off, I should say the mayor is permanent on it anyway right now. So that's no change. The deputy mayor is permanent on it anyway. So that's no change. The difference was I was the third person and I was permanent. And so we actually were responsible to the council for making sure that stuff was prepared properly. And it was set up so that, as Leslie Durgan used to say, we were ready for prime time. And we spent a lot less time on issues and got a lot better results, in my opinion. But that has nothing to do with direct election of mayor or not. It's a function of who's the mayor. Now, which goes to really the important point here. If you have a mayor who has the support of the council and has experience and is a person who is capable of fulfilling that role, then you can get a lot done in not too much time and in a way that most people feel satisfied with, even if they didn't get their own way. If you turn this into what appears to be one of the objectives here, where the mayor has more influence because of how they got elected than because of their position, their official position, you create all kinds of tension that you really don't need and isn't going to work well, I can guarantee you. And a perfect example of it is when mayors overstep their boundary, as happened with this in the current situation with the franchise discussions with Excel, where you have a mayor and a deputy mayor meeting behind the scenes, almost certainly illegally under the charter that requires open meetings of all committees, doing policy work on their own, and then dumping it on the council and the community. That doesn't work at all as a structure. So from my perspective, I prefer having a mayor who's selected by the council to run the process rather than a mayor who has two roles, one of which is official and one of which they get because in theory, somehow magically, by getting elected in a different process, they better represent the community. If there's
Thanks,
issues,
Steve.
let me just finish one thing here.
Yep.
If there are substantive issues that the community needs to vote on, they should get to vote on them as ballot measures, not by picking people.
Thanks, Steve.
Can I
Matt,
respond
yeah,
to that,
and-
Lori? But and then also it also addresses Judy's question, so it's kind of a twofer, if you don't mind.
Well, and the second question as well. So yeah,
Okay.
if you want to tackle both, that would be great. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I can try to swing that. So, you know, one of the things that we have that is an issue, and some of our newer council members were very much vocal about how they did not like the current process of how our mayor and mayor pro tem are selected. And more importantly, as far as a few of our council members pointed out, it was predetermined before the election was over. It was, we have two slates in our community, basically two political parties. And before the election, you know, the two candidates that were sort of the two members of council who were kind of leading those charges, basically were like, well, if I get a majority, I'll be mayor, you're pro tem. If you get the majority, you're mayor and I'm pro tem. And it was effectively predetermined. And then when the election result occurred, it was really just two choices delivered to council. So even their choices were limited because it had been predetermined. And this is not democratic in any way, and certainly isn't a process that is out in public for the public to even weigh in on. So bringing it up to the public, bringing in a political discourse is absolutely a better way than having a back alley two-party shaking hand determination as to how the mayor and mayor pro tem work out. And so really, as it comes down to slates, this is phase one of probably a few phases to limit the influence of slates and allow more moderation in our community. And it's not to say one slate is better or worse, but the inevitable outcome, which we see at our national level, is these slates are bifurcating our community. And I will ask people that have previously been on council and currently are, it is so much harder to find compromise because the way the slates have been manifesting in our electorate is everyone retreats to their political corners. And if we allow a mayor to be voted on with a system that doesn't have a spoiler effect, where slates don't just pick the determined winners, we are forced to find compromise and moderation in those outcomes, which is far better for our community as a whole. And so it's really important that we parse those pieces out and understand that the current system is not great. And is probably the least desirable, and we want to move to a better version, but we cannot and shall not let perfection be the enemy of the good. And so what we're offering is absolutely a better version of what we have. Is it perfect? No. Steve pointed out there's no perfect solution, but let's definitely take incremental improvement from what we currently have.
Great. Steve, any comments on the effect the slate of candidates might have going forward?
Yes. One thing should be obvious. The slates didn't work. We got people from both sides got elected. So much for the slates. As to the mayor and the deputy mayor, people, that happens. And they pick the people who they think are the most experienced. And they represented the different points of view between, I mean, in theory anyway, between Sam Weaver and Bob Yates, they represented the two sides. I mean, not that they really did, because I've talked to Bob Yates plenty, and Bob Yates and I agree on a lot of things. And I talked to Sam Weaver, who in theory I would agree with, and I don't agree with him on a lot of things. So I don't find any of that to be accurate at all. And frankly, I have had a lot more experience than almost anybody doing this stuff now who's still in the game.
Thank you. Just to circle back on a question that was addressed a little bit, but you know, to call it out, why is it necessary that the mayor have council support? Matt?
I mean, our ballot measure is implicitly says it's not necessary to have council support. I think this is more important to have support of the voters than support of council. We are already electing council, and they are adults and professionals, and they need to work together. But by parsing out one person that's not then selected by council, it does create, and sometimes tension is good, remind you, right? Sometimes that tension is helpful for people to focus in on what really needs to get done. And remind you, council will still get to a point, the pro tem. And so there will still be an elected person as mayor and then the appointed person as pro tem. And so council will still get to have an influence as to who the #2 ranking officer on council is. And so I think that that is a better balance rather than having everything funnel through council in one form. There's really any checks and balances that get placed on that.
Steve,
Well,
any feedback on
I
that?
say, I'm like, I've been there, I've done it. Not been mayor, but I created the system that we've got. And from my perspective, the critical piece is that the mayor and the pro tem and the third person on the agenda committee feel responsible to the council to deliver the goods so that there can be a proper discussion and a resolution of the real issues, not some made up issues. That was what happens now. And the fact that new people feel a bit out of it, that's a problem for the mayor and the deputy mayor to resolve. And if the mayor is chosen by some other process, the mayor has no obligation to the council whatsoever. And what really scares me, frankly, about doing it this way is somebody gets elected who really isn't competent to do the job of mayor. It's a job. It's not a political position in this town. It's a job. And even with this new system, it's still going to be a job. You have to be able to run meetings, get people involved, give them proper data, and make good decisions. That's a job. And just because somebody happens to be able to sell themselves to the public doesn't mean they're capable of doing that job.
Thanks, Steve. Point of clarification in this next question. Right now, City Council chooses the mayor from its ranks. Is it correct that in this new measure, someone could only run for mayor and not City Council in a given election? Matt?
Yeah, so this is some language that actually Steve recommended himself, and I completely agree with. And it was actually a clerical error in, again, the unique situation we're in, where we went from a voter petition ballot measure to a council referral petition. And when we handed the reins over to council, some of the language got lost in translation. And in this was a sentence that Steve reminded council of. That we should make sure that you cannot run for both simultaneously, and I 100% agree. Unfortunately, council chose not to actually approve that change in their final language, which was somewhat disappointing. But indeed, they could run right now simultaneously for like myself, who has ran, and for those who have, you must be really crazy if you want to run for both at the same time. Yeah, I don't know how anyone has the bandwidth for that, but it's important to realize we have until 2023 to run this election, and there will undoubtedly need to be some additions to the charter that clarify some of the issues that the county clerk and the city need to resolve and how to implement this. And in that cleanup, in that addition, a sentence like this is absolutely something that we would support, to just say, yeah, let's just make sure that you can't run for both at the same time. But we've got 3 years to sort that out. But that is something that's on our radar, it's on council's radar, and Steve was helpful enough to kind of remind council that this is an important thing that we need to fix.
There are a number of points here. From my perspective, the most important requirement I would add, were I to support this, which I don't right now, is that you can't run for mayor unless you've already served 2 years on council. Because you need people with experience. Putting somebody in that position who doesn't have experience is insane, frankly. And that would, to me, solve a lot of this, because it would also reduce the numbers very significantly. And that would be really important, because then ranked choice voting, if we get it, which I don't like, but if we get it, at least has a chance of functioning. When you get a lot of people running, and there's no particular reason why somebody would just run for council, why not run for mayor at the same time? It doesn't cost any more money. Under the current thing, it's like crazy. And so you could get 20 people running for mayor at the same time. Try filling out a 20 by 20 chart on ranked choice voting. Not easy.
Lord, can I just clarify on real quick on that point? So we've spoken to a few election attorneys that have done election law all over the state, and they made a point that actually the city cannot implement prerequisites for an elected office outside of just setting voter age. So as much as that might be a preferred outcome for some, as far as we were told, that's prohibited by the state constitution and a few other levels that we can't do that. So I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong, but I just want to make sure we're not thinking of something that may not even be possible in that sense, even if some like it. But it would be worth getting more clarification. But we were told that that's not something you can do. It would violate state constitution.
Well, I hope you didn't ask our attorney, our city attorney.
I did not.
Good.
So we are nearing our final 2 minutes here. One last question. It was mentioned that this measure will increase or improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. Could you speak to how or how not and elaborate on that? And I'll save a minute or two for each of you, and then we'll wrap up.
So a couple things. I mean, I can certainly describe, I'll describe it, but also say you just look to some of these other cities. There was a recent report put out, and I'm happy to share that with folks. In fact, I might even be able to put it really quickly in the chat. Yeah, look at that. That's the beauty of Zoom. We can instantaneously share information. That is just wonderful. So let's see, will it let me? Of course, I said that, and now it won't let me do it. Oh, son of a gun. All right, it won't even let me copy it over. It must be too big. Anyway, so report just basically was saying that in studying a bunch of cities that employ instant runoff ranked choice voting, that there are more women candidates, and more women win. There are more LGBTQ candidates, and more of them win. And there are more minority groups, and not just minorities of, say, color and religion, but minorities of thought and policy. Minority political groups are now feeling empowered because they don't have to feel like they vote for a lesser of two evils. And by ranking, they get to know that they can vote their conscience and still know that, you know what, even though we're a minority party, we've got our candidate, they probably won't win, but I'm still going to vote for them, number one. But I do know that on my third vote, I'm okay with this person being mayor. And so they know their vote counts, and they know it will ultimately count, and it won't be wasted voting their preference, which means that they participate in greater numbers and engage in the discourse. So it's fundamental to the mechanism of ranked choice voting that improves that. It's also vital for us to do the education. We need to do the voter education to let people know that they're empowered that way. And that's something that we gave ourselves and the city that 3 years to do that education, to really do that outreach, to make sure that everybody in all corners of Boulder feel like in this new system, they can participate, be heard, and improve our community as a result.
Well, just one really important point about this. Ranked choice voting is not the only way to do this. Mm-hmm. Approval voting works just as well for that. You can have the same many candidates run. People get to vote for as many people as they want. No problem. And like I said, the great advantage of approval voting, it's really simple. The county can run it. And if you really want to pay attention to this stuff, if you go to the Center for Election Science, electionscience.org, and look up approval voting versus RCV, ranked choice voting, approval voting versus RCV at electionscience.org. They have an excellent article discussing the two methods and the advantages and disadvantages of both. So do not assume that somehow ranked choice voting is magic and everything else doesn't work for that perspective. Approval voting works from their perspective, and these are the guys in the business, works way better.
Can I just respond real quick, just as clarifying? Approval voting is not on the ballot. We're not having a debate over which voting method to choose here. We are on the ballot getting the choice to choose nothing or instant runoff ranked choice voting. And if you talk to League of Women Voters and other election experts, they will say both of these methods are vast improvements of our current plurality voting system. And that's why I said earlier, let's not let the pursuit of perfection be the enemy of the good. Approval voting has only been used in one city in the US, Fargo, North Dakota, and it was just used this June. And the results are not that impressive, to be honest, when you look at the results. It looks like it would have been the same outcome whether they had a new voting system or not. So let's not litigate which system. Either one will be an improvement. And right now, it's instant runoff ranked choice voting that is for the voters to decide. And we should be comfortable that this will be a vast improvement over the current system, regardless of the other voting methods, which all have good, strong merits.
I disagree. That we're not even talking next year, we're talking 2023 from my perspective. Vote this thing down and let's put a working group together where we can really do the work on something like this and then put something forward that voters can make a real choice about, not just what's on the ballot now that happened to be put on by a bunch of council members who really didn't think this thing through.
Thanks to both Matt and Steve, as well as Todd and Rui. Spirited discussion this afternoon and really important information. Before we conclude, I do just want to do a special thanks to our sponsors, Google, WW Reynolds, Zayo, as well as BTC. Without the support of our sponsors, we couldn't offer programs like this, and so special thanks to those organizations for your support. Finally, if there's additional materials that any of our speakers would like to share with our attendees, we can do a follow-up. And I think most of our questions to get answered, but if folks still have outstanding questions, encourage you to either contact the speakers directly or go through us at the chamber. We're happy to be a conduit. Thanks very much, and be sure to vote this fall. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, thanks.